as we learned, it's difficult to survive writing open source software somehow and get funded. And I hope we're going to learn a lot about this from Tobias.
Yeah, thank you and welcome everybody. So nice to see so many people. And I'm very happy to share some of the insights from our open source funding, what we found from an maybe company perspective, what's behind open source, what some of the ideas, inspirations, as well as challenges there are. And first, I want to give a huge shout out to some of the inspiration from 2 years ago. Which I actually got at this event, talking to both people here as well as the presentation from Roger, giving some insights in how such a setup can work. And with that, what are we going to talk today about? I want to highlight a bit what is the challenge with open source and open source funding, what are some of the problems we have there, how as a company or especially probably larger enterprise we can help, how that can work, a bit deep dive into like internal processes and challenges with that, and then how to actually select projects for funding. I remember today morning there was a question about how projects are selected, and I wanted to share some perspective on what we ended up doing, and as well interested in what your ideas might be to improve on that. And lastly, I want to share some insights on what we learned worked well, which you can maybe adopt as well for your own setup. So, quick introduction, who is SAP? Probably most of you have heard of us, but I want to highlight some things. So a huge German and European software company with around 100,000 employees and with over like 35,000 people in development related roles. We build a lot of different solutions, and the important thing is we actually use a lot of open source underneath it. We heard earlier today as well that, in some cases, open source makes up 50, 60, 70, 80% of a solution. And I can only confirm that this is as well true in larger enterprises. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to build software which actually brings value and not build the seventh left pad at the end of the day. So what is the problem now? We have a lot of open source software. It's all for free. We can use it. We can build cool things on top of it and sell products. Yes, but I pretty much couldn't have done it better because we pretty much saw the same slide earlier today already. So we have a lot of open source dependencies, which make up, at the end of the day, a huge part of our product. And that has as well implications. They make up a lot of the improvements as well. So if there are changes to the open source dependencies, be it positive, they can have a huge positive impact as well on the overall solution, or the other way around, if they are neglected or if they have problems, that has as well implications on the solution. So it's our responsibility as well to ensure the whole thing is good. But what are these open source dependencies even? And when we talk about open source, I sometimes get the feeling that we are thinking about, okay, we have a company A and we have one big open source thing. And I think we need to make sure that if we think about open source, it's not one single entity doing open source. We have a lot of various actors, companies, foundations, interacting, maintaining, providing open source projects with a lot of different characteristics, requirements, and what they can offer or not. We have on the one hand side company-driven open source projects. We saw just beforehand GitLab, for example. There's a company behind that. You can do contracts with them. You can buy an enterprise solution from them. That's an option. On the other hand side, we have foundation projects where foundation sits behind them, takes on the governance, sometimes even more active in the project development. Sometimes they only do, only in quotes, they mainly take care of the governance and other structures. but don't really invest too much into the actual development of a project. And lastly, we have probably the bit romanticized developer who sits there, maintains one component at home since 20 years, things like XZ or the famous XKCD of a one maintainer in Nebraska maintaining a supercritical component which everything else is built on. And lastly, somewhere in between, we also have people, probably like some of us here, who are pretty much paid to maintain open source software as part of their daily work. But I want to dive in the next time a bit into the middle. So the open source projects maintained by a single person in their spare time, probably because they started that off as a student project, or because they had fun doing that 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and then everybody started using that, and they now feel obligated and sometimes even forced to keep on maintaining it because the whole world runs on that. Sometimes they don't want to do that, sometimes they like doing that, but at the end of the day, they are doing it, and I think that's something we need to honor. So these people, they are doing a crucial job, and we somehow can and want to help them with that. And I think one thing I want to shout out here is how can we support these single projects maintained by a couple of, or by a single maintainer somewhere. First, probably quite obvious, we can contribute through code, we can provide bug reports if they are good on what's going wrong, then provide fixes to these bugs, or even submit feature requests and features alongside them. Or if a project is looking for it and we have a capacity, we can as well take on a maintainer role if we have the knowledge in-house or so. But sometimes we are not the experts for everything, or probably nobody is the expert for everything. And sometimes these are components where there is like 2 people in the world who have the knowledge for it. For example, I remember earlier for the optimization of like the stillators, there's like one guy who wrote that in the 80s. It would have probably been super cool if he would still have maintained that and it would be up to date and super fast and so on. And you don't have like, okay, I want now to maintain that, I can just step up, and we have seen that you actually need some time investment to get up to speed to maintain it. So sometimes the best solution is just to support the people already having the knowledge, already having the expertise, and with time, and at the end of the day, in my opinion, time boils down to money. And that can take different forms, and I want to outline pretty much the idea was rather straightforward, is hey, we have important open source projects maintained by individuals and we want to support them with money. So far, so easy. And when I went to my purchasing department and said we want to do that, they said, yeah, no problem, go for it, and end of talk. No. As you can probably imagine, I guess at Siemens there were similar challenges with how to actually set this up and what are some of the requirements. So I actually did went to my purchasing department and said, hey, we have this idea, how can we make that happen? And they went, okay, you want to give people money? What is this even? And can we pay via invoice? That was the second question. And so the question is, okay, we are supporting developers, is that sponsoring? And I talked to our sponsoring team, which is part of marketing, and they said, well, we don't really see it as a marketing effort. And to be honest, I have to agree, we are not doing that mainly to do marketing, but to actually help people running the crucial software we depend on. So the next, they sent me to, okay, it's kind of a donation. And the donation folks told me, yeah, but are they a non-profit organization, an official one? And while some foundations maybe have statuses which are kind of like that, they are, for example, not full non-profit under like German law. Lastly, we ended then up with software purchasing, which sounds a bit strange, but if you think about it, we are using software and at the end of the day we pay for it, just that we can use it for free as long as we want, and we can choose as well how much we want to spend for it. So pretty nice deal at the end of the day. And that's where we ended up with our purchasing process, that this is pretty much just like buying in commercial software. And yeah, the second question was then, okay, if it's like a software purchase, are the other party a supplier? We heard earlier, probably not. And probably if I go to a person, to an individual maintainer and go, hey, we would like to support you, but for this we need to onboard you as a supplier. Here's our standard 200-page supplier contract. Please forward it to your legal department. I will probably get the response, what legal department? If I even get a response. So we looked in how can we combine this individual person, which probably doesn't want, can, need to be onboarded to our full process while still complying with our internal process. And luckily, we are not the only one with this problem. There are actual platforms existing who help with that. Probably big ones already mentioned earlier today as well. Things like Buy Me a Coffee, which is more smaller than Open Collective, which is actually super powerful and gives insight as well in how the money is spent. I found it's, especially for projects which have more maintainers, it can be super helpful to as well get an overview. Or lastly, GitHub sponsors, which similar acts as like you give money to GitHub and then let GitHub redistribute it to the individual maintainers or projects. And that's as well what we ended up doing. So these platforms are super helpful intermediaries bridging the gap between normal purchasing processes, because I can pay that via invoice. GitHub is part of Microsoft. We have already a standard supplier contract in place with them. All good, all people are happy. Second topic, compliance. Okay, I want to give people money. So far, so good. But who can I actually give money to, or who I shouldn't? And there are two big things we identified which could be problematic. On the one hand side, SAP employees or our own employees. So giving them money is, or the challenge there is, if an SAP employee maintains a project and we benefit from it, giving them money sounds, or giving them, or they maintain it in their spare time and we additionally give them money for that, sounds okay at the top. But then things like, okay, but if you give money to an employee, that then needs to account for social tax and things like that. So that's a big thing where we said, okay, red tape, we don't want to touch that. So that's something we need to check for. Is the person receiving money somehow affiliated with SAP? And the other thing is pretty much international sanctions. But here platforms can be helpful as well, because they pretty much already ensure that that sanctioned parties can't receive money. Another advantage from compared to directly interacting with people. And the last and probably the biggest question is, okay, I want to give money to somebody, but where does the money come from? And if you are working in a larger company, you probably know there are budgets, your team has a budget, and it somehow needs to be generated. And while open source software is used maybe across the company, it's super hard to figure out what is the actual dollar value of that open source used. Do you measure that by usage? So is it used 5 times? Do you measure it by revenue of the product behind it? How do you allocate that? It's super hard, and to be frank, we didn't find a great solution for that. So for the moment, we ended up with saying, okay, we have a central budget from somebody who said, hey, it's a general good idea to support the most critical components where a lot of teams are benefiting from. but it's at no point sustainable or completely sustainable. I still think, and that's what I want to highlight as well, it's good to get started. Next question is, okay, we have a process in place. I have some budget which I can give out, but how much do I give a project or a single maintainer? And we ended up finding that that's not an easy question to answer, because depending on how you look at it, you look at what does the project need, how much do you benefit from the project, something in between, and how do you measure that? Do you measure that based on the complexity of a project? And how do you even measure complexity of a project? And so what we ended up for our first setup is to keep it simple, and pretty much said that for each maintainer we selected in project, we ended up giving $250 over a 12-month period, so each month $250. Idea was, okay, for a single maintainer, that's not a single coffee, so better than that, but it's also not a full-time employment. But it gives people, for example, if you are a freelancer, maybe a day a month time to focus on your project, or maybe after a year buy a new shiny laptop to work on your project, or just go on a weekend where if you worked on the week in the evening hours on your open source project, then take the weekend off for like a spa thing. But idea was it's an amount which can have some impact. Not a super huge one. You can't drop your or leave your day job over it, but it has, you can do something with it. Okay, our ideas are selected, we have a process, we have an amount, but who do we give that to? And the important thing I wanted to highlight here, and I think is super challenging as well, if you go into an engineering room and say, hey, what's the most important project we should support? Or even what's the most important testing framework we should support? You probably have 5 people and 7 opinions who are going to kill each other over what's now the best and most important whatever project. And we found it's quite important to not even end up with that discussion and rather say, it doesn't really matter if it's now the best fitting project for that. It is enough if it's a good project. So good here is, again, better than perfect. And there are things, when hindsight, we might say, okay, another project would maybe have been better. But then we can as well say, okay, maybe we should just support both. And so how do you select actual projects? We ended up with pretty much the problem. We have thousands of possibilities, even excluding the projects maintained by companies or maintained by foundations. And we don't even actually know what's our goal with the funding yet. So we want to support them, but do we want to support projects which are doing a very well job and say, hey, super cool, keep on doing that? Or do we want to focus on projects which maybe have some security challenges, some technical dev to say, hey, it would be great, we would really appreciate if you can invest some time into addressing them. And I'll go in a minute on what we ended up on. The first approach, very similar to the Siemens one, is we had a process where internal colleagues could nominate projects under some specific requirements, which pretty much boils down to it must be open source, it should be allowed for usage at SAP. It isn't allowed that it's like maintained by an SAP person. But the 2 interesting things are the last ones with we encourage that a second team from a disjunct unit should support that nomination. We wanted to ensure that projects from, or that we want support projects with a central budget which are used across the company, rather than saying, okay, if a single team or single unit is using it, then maybe their budget should as well be used for supporting that. And the second thing, which I find a quite interesting approach and have seen by others as well, is we said, okay, rather than, or we don't want to only give central money to projects, or to open source, but we also want to encourage contributions. And so we put down as a requirement that people can only nominate and vote on projects where they, if they contributed to any third-party open source project. It must not, or it doesn't need to be the same one they nominate. They just need to have contributed back something to the broader open source community. It works really good to identify critical projects for a few products, especially because people know what they are kind of using, but it as well likely returns you with very well-known projects. Things like people are touching every day and then agree on, and a voting tends to highlight these things. So we ended up using that for a subset of projects. And then the second approach was more on a central selection, where we use data we have internally available on the selection. And I see I'll have to speed up a bit. And that was based on pretty much how much are we using one, as well as metrics like project activity, external scores like an OpenSSF scorecard, but more interesting, things like a buzz factor. How much does a project depend on that single maintainer? Because we said, okay, we want to especially support these projects where a single maintainer probably somewhat thanklessly was maintaining that going on, and say, hey, we appreciate that you take that investment and time to take care of that. Good thing is you don't directly have an inherent bias towards well-known projects, but it's also not perfect. So you get a first indication, but still need to manually go through that list. And so we ended up with quite a bunch of different projects, and I won't go into too much detail. We have here a screenshot from like our internal list plus other projects we have funded in similar fashion. And I pretty much just want to highlight here, you probably don't find too much similarities between these projects. It's all over the place, from like AI frameworks to very basic, in quotes, tools like sudo. And that's by design. So we didn't want to say we only now support JavaScript frameworks, but rather anything which at the end of the day helps us build great solutions, be it developer tooling, be it direct dependencies, be it something else. So what did we learn across the journey? Pretty much start small. Don't try to tackle the whole problem at once, because if you go to your people and say, hey, I need X million billion dollars to support open source, you probably won't end up somewhere. And already small steps help. And so starting off with 1 or 2 projects, maybe you already have something in mind, and then it's fine that you don't have like an official selection process. Just have like, hey, we have 2 projects, we can already figure out the process with them. Keep it simple in that regard as well. If you have projects which might not be like gray zoned, so we had a nomination, for example, where the project itself is fine to be supported, but one of SAP colleagues is actually co-maintainer of the project, and there might be some way to work around that. But that was like, okay, we have enough other projects which are well enough candidates that we say, okay, not at the moment. And lastly, what I really like about this event as well, exchange with others, especially with some of the challenges. Ask me, ask probably Roger how they achieved that. That helped us a lot in getting that set up. And so it's now my part to ask you if you have questions, opinions, or something. Thank you. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, so I noticed you mentioned several times foundations as sort of like a third entity, but I would actually say there are, let's say, private projects and company-backed projects, and they can be on their own or hosted at a foundation, because admittedly, I don't know a single foundation that pays anybody to develop anything. It's sort of like a free home where you can just have your project and you maybe get some service like legal protection and stuff like that. Because also in your list of projects that are supported, I didn't see any, well, Apache, Eclipse, Linux Foundation projects. Not all of them are backed by companies. So
Yeah, I agree. So we had actually, for example, nominations for some maintainers maintaining foundation-backed projects. What we found, or what the distinction we found, is if a foundation is in play, they sometimes as well have direct funding channels. Sometimes, not always, and if they end up at the project is as well sometimes questionable or not always clear. For example, I know that Apache Log4j has an interesting page where it says, okay, you can support the foundation either directly, or here are the maintainers and their personal profiles which you can support. But that, yeah, pretty much that. But if you support the foundation directly, that's probably, and that's the good thing about a foundation, they can do contracts, they can create an invoice, you can pay the invoice. That's purchasing-wise rather straightforward.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Let's keep going sponsoring open source.